page.
It's not yet live. Now I'm going live. Takes a bit of time.
It's going to pop up on your page.
Yeah, it's not yet there. Should be very soon. I've started recording. You can see it on my page, and then I'm sharing it to the warriors. And then you can hear me again. On my page,
Here we go.
Yes, you have it there, right?
Yep.
Wonderful. So let me also share it myself. What's happening with my phone? Okay, I'll share that. So yeah, part 2 today. Super nice.
Part 2.
Part 2, exactly. Super nice.
Yes, wonderful to be with you again. So let's see. I guess I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see. Here we go. So do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, absolutely, we can.
Yes.
Just to tie it in with the first part, was you, after we chatted and we were both very excited what came up, you felt that there was some parts that we could go really deeper and further practically, and there are some questions that we can also answer a bit more today. So I'm very curious of what needs to be expressed. So I'll just pass it on to you to catch it up from the last time and continue.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. I felt like there were a couple of things that I wanted to address more thoroughly. I felt like the answers were good, but to really address the important depth of what you're at, why is it that we should employ astrological practice relative to how we're trying to construct our lives. And specifically, you began by stating like how, we're in a transition point, and everyone can kind of feel that there's this transformation taking place. And I think to adequately describe that, what we're really talking about is the transformation of the modern era. The modern worldview science has rendered for us to address the deeper questions, whether we're asking. Like, we didn't actually address the hard problem of consciousness last time, which is right at the center of this. I mean, when Chalmers is asking, why do we have consciousness? It's ultimately a theological question. It's not a question that is properly within the realms of scientific discovery or assessment, because, the science doesn't actually ask why questions. It's actually constantly asking how questions. And then we're supposed to build up to a why, but it's ultimately a philosophical. We can adequately understand astrology unless we place it in the evolution of consciousness. And to do that, I think Richard Tarnas's work is where I'm getting most of my understanding and information. And what he has done is constructed a mandala and of the evolution of worldviews. And I've kind of riffed off of that, incorporated Jean Geb psychological development, childhood psychological development as a way that we can up to the current modern postmodern worldview. And the nature of our relationship to the archetypal realm or to astrological phenomena or to the sacred dimension of reality is what's at stake here, what's really and what's important. So this is the monolith starts here in the primal world process of differentiation or individuation. So the hunter-gatherer states of consciousness prehistory, and then this is the beginning of like the city states, the ancient Egypt and the Maya and like the first cities prior to the axial period of the axial era of evolution. Excuse me. So I'm going to make this simple. It's basically a process of moving from an undifferentiated sense of unity to an individual, differentiated, autonomous sense of an I in relationship to the whole. So in the hunter-gatherer state, let's see. What's happening is the self is permeable, like our sense of identity was more of a we consciousness rather than an I consciousness. And the hunter-gatherer state, so like you can also understand this as Gebser's archaic and magic structures and Piaget's sensory motor. So it's just the beginning of like recognition of like circular motions is the way Piaget describes it. At the archaic stage, like this is basically where the first city states emerge. We have a pharaoh, we have chiefs, and our sense of relationship to the archetypal realm is funneled through the chief. Like the pharaoh is the mediator to the divine, whereas before we are embedded in a meaningful relationship. There's meaning in the world, there's meaning in the self, and differentiated and placed into the pharaoh as like the mediator to the transcendent. And then we move into the axial era, and this is a critical stage in evolution called the Axial Era of Revolution or Axial Era period, where cross-culturally the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Zoroaster, the Hebrew Bible began its redaction. And what's important is the emergence of second order thinking, the emergence of critical self-reflection that wasn't really happening in the archaic and in the primal worldview. It's an emergence of individual selfhood. This is really the beginning of this vision that Descartes reifies in the modern era, but it begins here, like Plato places the forms in the heavens. Buddha, it's nirvana is transcendent, whereas samsara is the immanent. So there's this differentiation between meaning and like purpose and the archetypal realm being placed into the heavens, whereas the world is seen as an image of that and not really, it's the world, like in Plato, it's the world of becoming, whereas the world of being is transcendent, and that's what we're aligning ourselves with. Like in Christianity, God made man in its image, and so we're striving to align ourselves with the divine. And so what's also important is it's in this period in the archaic, the astrological perspective is just for the king or for the chief. It's just for the omens. It's just like the collective, right? So, but then in the axial period, we get our first individual birth charts. So in that same time that the second order thinking and critical self-reflection is emerging, we're also striving, or we're beginning to recognize the individual's relationship to the cosmos. And so then in the modern era, we can see this as like where the differentiation became solidified in a certain way, and where this is an I-thou relationship to the creative and transcendent meaning and purpose. This becomes an I-it relationship. So we see like the human mind figured out we were the center of the universe. This is one of the most important events in history, where all the religions were saying we were the center, and the human mind realized that we weren't. And that inflated, it became like an inflated sense of self. That's why we're so big here. And the world is becoming devoid of meaning and purpose. And like with Jean Gebster's evolution of consciousness, you can see this as the deficient mental stage, where it's the mental begins in the axial, and then it becomes deficient because it's basically a materialistic appropriation or an idolatry kind of projection of what we think is the material world is, rather than seeing it with its sacred depths. And then the postmodern era is like where we have kind of stripped all of the meaning and purpose out of the world, and now we're questioning whether we have meaning and purpose as well. The postmodern era is like, is there any up or down? Like the secular age and Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God is a big part of what the crisis of meaning is in our current state. Like, is there a transcendent source of meaning at all? Are we meant to be here, or are we just a smart primate that accidentally evolved into this meaning seeking, seeing as though we have meaning in this, seeing spirit in the world, but not having it reflected back to us in our religions and our scientific worldview. We're just Big Bang cosmology.
I think that's one of the biggest questions, like, are they all species searching for meaning, or is just us searching for meaning? And what does that mean in the end? And I think that we still don't really have an answer for that, if we are the only animal searching for meaning or not.
That's a really good question. And we can't, it's hard for us to, conceptualize or move into like a whale's consciousness to think, what is meaning in a whale consciousness. It's a fascinating question, but the fact that we can ask those questions and think about them seems to indicate that that's important. And like this is actually directly at what Chalmers is asking. Why do we have this self-reflective consciousness? And really what he's talking about is just that upper layer, in a sense, of self-reflection that we're kind of saying that human beings have a special experience of, a special performance of. And I think that's actually what the astrological perspective is kind of intimating towards. Like it's a recovery of the archetypal depth that we previously were embedded within. Like, we didn't see a difference between meaning and purpose in the world, but in this evolution, in the process of individuation, because what's happening is a two-step process, or you can see it in two folds. So like we've stripped meaning and purpose out of the cosmos, but we've also solidified a certain autonomy with more individual agency to negotiate that relationship. Whereas before, we didn't have as much will power and agency to negotiate. We were kind of still embedded within and participating like unconsciously. We're just part of it. We're seeing the symbols and signals and signs, and we're relating to them, we're acting on them, but we're not in a differentiated understanding or differentiated relationship with them. And that's what this process has been about. And what's important about it in the end is that we get the math right. We're not the center of the universe. And then we discover the three outer planets, which this is where the three outer planets indicate the depth of the human psyche. They reflect the depth of the human psyche. And more importantly, I guess this is where it'll be important to talk about the perinatal matrices from Stan Grof. So like in the previous discussion we had, I mentioned how it was Stan Grof's work in LSD therapy that was the source of the astrological revelation for both Rick and Stan, is that they were striving to understand, get better insight into the potential psychedelic experiences and the previous psychedelic experiences they had had and what would be happening there. And another aspect of what was taking place, that in Grof's research prior to their discovery of astrology, he recognized through thousands of clients going through in tremendous death rebirth experiences that they were actually reverting back to their birth. They were psychologically regressing to re-experiencing aspects of their birth itself, aspects of birth itself. And what he recognizes that there were 4 distinct stages. There's an undifferentiated state where this is basically the first 9 months where we're just embedded, and we're just like developing, gestating as a fetus in the womb. And if it's a good womb, like your mothers are in good health and good relationship, it's generally experienced as bliss. As you're in heaven, you're part of the ocean of consciousness, you're part of the whole thing. That's what people connect back to. But then as soon as the first contraction begins, the cervix is still closed, but you feel as though you've been cast out of heaven, like where you've been in communion. And then all of a sudden you're in hell. So it's a movement from paradise to paradise lost. And everything experienced in this stage is experienced negatively until you get out of it. So it's all the shadow side of Saturn. So, and then the third stage is when the cervix is dilated, it's opening, and there's pressure still, but the child is moving through the birth canal. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. And this is experienced as a death rebirth struggle itself. It's like a pyrocathartic, transformative experience that is filled with all sorts of Plutonic imagery. And then the final stage is correlated to Uranus, and it's the actual birth, the liberation from the death rebirth struggle. And what's really important about this is that this is it's kind of like a genetic code, or it's a cosmic code. It's like this is the hero's journey, differentiating out of the tribe of being, facing intense experiences, deep experiences, and then the revelation of finding your uniqueness and coming back to the community, bringing back your wholeness. And you can also see, this as the same process. It's a process of birth, of differentiation from the womb and intense experiences, and then back into some form of liberation. So it's really it was incredibly intriguing to Rick and Stan that the 4 outer planets, the archetypal dimensions of them, what we understand of them, actually map onto the 4 perinatal stages of birth, when there was no intention for doing that. I mean, the perinatal sequence was developed by Grof over years of watching many clients go through these states. And Grof was a Freudian trained psychoanalyst. He was not a Jungian. He wasn't into archetypes and the myth and stuff, but he was forced to readjust his cartography because of the evidence that was coming from his clients. So basically, I think what I wanted to do here, I think, or well, here's a really excellent diagram from Rick, which is, like, why does the birth, like, why is it so important? It is this threshold of experience. I mean, clearly it's a death rebirth struggle, and it kind of makes sense why it has so much potency, because it is something everyone goes through potentially thousands and thousands of times, many lifetimes of experience that are imprinted on us. Like it's like in the same way that archetypes work, they're the historical record, in a sense, of all the experience that's ever happened in certain genres. Like as a father, all father experiences have been in a sense like deposited in the archetypal realm. And what's happening is that like the birth process itself is like a threshold where you're bringing in the archetypal unconscious, like collective memories, karmic memories, ancestral, phylogenetic, and it goes in. It's why at the moment of birth, it is a picture of the archetypal dynamics at that moment in time. And it's why the meaning of the archetypes it's what the connection to, like, this is how we were participating. And so it gives us a picture, a diagram of how the birth chart of the alignment of those complexes in our life. Now, I think I can make this more.
What's coming into mind with like many
Yes,
things
please.
actually relate to this, to the last drawing that you're
Yes.
having there. But one that's coming into mind, and it can be just an assumption that's coming in, because there are many processes of death and rebirth throughout our lifetime. And I feel that most of us have specific ways of approaching them. And I'm wondering if in every lifetime that relates a bit with the first time we experienced it, that is like during birth, meaning if we're getting born a specific date and time, we also passed the previous stages in other cosmic constellations. So practically all of our stages have a birth print or have a blueprint, right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering if we keep repeating them, like replaying them over our lifetimes every time we're going into a cycle of death and rebirth.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. And then I last interview, I described it as archetypal fields, that their archetypes, the archetypes operate, it seems, as in fields of consciousness, or fields, or karmic fields, like kind of the way you're describing it there. And it's yeah, that's exactly what's happening. How to describe this? Okay, so like in the last conversation, I described how the Saturn-Pluto complex in history, like World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, 9/11, and the pandemic, that when they're in the alignments, there's an archetypal field that's constellated, and we are participating in that archetypal field. And the same would be true for in our births, like we're carrying those complexes. And what happens is when we experience things in the outer world that trigger some aspect of the complex that we're carrying, it's the resonant quality that does the triggering. If you have a Saturn Pluto in your natal chart, and then there's a Saturn Pluto alignment in the sky, it will often trigger the complexes, the specific aspects of the complexes that you're carrying. And like, it seems, this is what one of the tremendous insights from Grof's work is, that it seems as though our first experience, like I'll just use sexuality. Our first sexual experience is often in the birth process itself. You're struggling to live, and the libido, the plutonic libido, is the will to survive, and you're in that death, potential death experience. The plutonic id is catalyzed to survive. And so it's why infant children, male children, would be born with erections, is because there's a sexual instinct to procreate, to live, as one is being killed potentially. The same thing happens when men are hung. at times men will get an erection right before hanging,
Mhm.
and it's the same impulse. And then what Grof also recognized is that like the desire for asphyxiation in sexual arousal is due in part most likely to our first sexual experience happening in the struggle to breathe. So there's a resonant quality or a desire from the organism to connect back to the initial trauma unconsciously. And it's why the desire to have that experience is an unconscious desire to rid one of the trauma that one is carrying.
And I also feel that this relation between almost like the paradise and falling out of the paradise in a way, and the expulsion from paradise practically, because probably that's how it's feeling, that you wouldn't get out of there unless you start feeling the contractions probably. It's really interesting how it ties in to so many religious experiences and stories and everything. And I kind of feel that many times we're trying to trace back the moments of trauma just to be able to go in the previous situation before it. So like kind of get back into this paradise state, which I feel it's also like usually our driving force to create a better future. It's like this memory of having somewhere experienced this union and bliss, that we are constantly trying to create it.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's the Neptune archetype, the union, the bliss. And that's the first perinatal matrix, like you're saying, the paradise aspect. And there's, it seems likely the case. And I don't want to, I say that because I just don't want to sound dogmatic, but it pretty much is the case that addiction and escapist tendencies are a desire to get back to that intrauterine state or to union with the divine, which is also Neptune. It's an archetypal state, and where the desire to get back there is where you see a lot of addiction tendencies, and and it's all correlated to the Neptune archetype. So that's exactly it. It's like we're carrying the complexes individually, and when we encounter experiences in the world that match them or trigger them in some way, that's where the work needs to be done. It gets catalyzed. And like what I was also going to say is that it's the same is true with our first sexual experience, but it's also our first violent experience. Like it's a violent experience to be born, and you are also in the struggle impending violence on the mother's contracting uterus. So like it seems that the roots of violence are in the perinatal experience, and it makes sense because it's the Saturn and Pluto second and third stage that the world wars and the what's happening is the Saturn is the superego, our sense of right and wrong and judgment and creating boundaries, and Pluto is the id, and it's what we're repressing, what the superego is repressing, and it's also what we fear and we project onto others. So the tendency to create strong boundaries and the superego to be intensified by the id, and then to project the id as shadow onto the other, and then desire to kill them or to eliminate them, is what we see over and over again with the Saturn-Pluto complex. And I think this is important. Like this is, I think helpful, whereas there's only one archetype. Like there's only one Saturn archetype. It's within us, and it's within the world. And like Saturn, like it's senex is the Latin, where we get senator and senile and senescence, but it's the father figure. And it's like I was saying before, like all fathers and that have existed on some level, it's imprinted in the archetype, or the archetype has been the constellating factor of all father experiences. And so the principle of order and discipline and integrity, structure. It's all Saturn. Anywhere you see structure in the world, that's the Saturn archetype. It's like in us, like our moral integrity is a Saturn structure. The skin is a Saturn structure. The eliminative system is Pluto, Plutonic, but consonance is the Saturnian structure of being to withhold in integrity. It's the same for the womb. The cervix and the container, the womb itself is a Saturnian structure. So like what's happening is, or like constipation can be a Saturn-Pluto phenomenon, because Saturn is the constricting and Pluto is the eliminative forces. So like what's happening is everyone has Saturn and Pluto in them. It's in the cosmos. Depending on how they're aligned in one's natal chart or by transit, that's the way you're in relationship to them. And astrology helps us get into relationship with them, helps us to identify those different structures. And I'm just talking about one, but that's how Saturn, the moral structure, the body and structure, it's integrity, period. Right. And but the same is true for Mercury, principle of mind and communication. It's always there, but how it's aligned in your birth chart indicates how you're working with that archetype in a specific way relative to the other planets it's in relationship with, or when it's happening in the world, which we're about to look at. It's how are we enacting our creative will with the archetypal field that's present at that time.
So do you feel that like right now we're experiencing a rebirthing, like in the age that is coming? Is that the process that seems to be happening?
Yes.
Take us to what's happening.
Yeah, I think what's happening is the ending of the materialistic, mechanistic worldview. It's failing. It's reached its limit. It's no longer capable of providing answers that we are asking. So it's dying. And the astrological perspective is one of the ways in which we can recover meaning and purpose, and the archetypes that aren't actually, they were never separate. That division, the differentiation, we're still hunter-gatherer in a participation mystique if we choose to orient to the world that way. And real quick, this is also Iain McGilchrist's big point, is that it's the left hemisphere that objectified him, did this abstraction, which is part of the individuation process, but it takes the right hemisphere reintegration of right metaphor, depth, thinking, symbol, archetype, rich, the context of things. That's thing, and can help us do that. So yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again with you, and tell me, do you see just a chart now?
Yes, we do.
Natal chart, great. Yeah, so what we're looking at here is the planets in the sky right now. The sun and Venus and Pluto are all in what's called a triple conjunction today. This is Mercury and Saturn, and then this is Jupiter. And the moon and Neptune are in a conjunction today, and they're in a square to Mars. One of the big things that's happening, like the biggest thing that's happened is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Saturn and Pluto, they were in a conjunction here in the same place in the sky for the past 3 years. I'm gonna just move in months here, just to give you an idea. Like you can see how Saturn and Pluto have been together since 2018. They haven't really moved. Jupiter came in during the pandemic, which was both an expansion, a blessing in many ways, and expanded the whole thing. But yeah, so that's just to give you an idea of the Saturn-Pluto alignment that's been the overarching intense coloration of what we've been doing, how we've been participating in fear and anxiety and constriction forces that have been imposed on us or that we've had to adhere to. And but what's happening right now is that Venus, which normally it is moving with the sun about a degree per day or so, but every 18 months or so, it does a retrograde motion where it stops in the sky and moves backwards. And then so it's doing that now. And it did it in a conjunction with Pluto, which you often see with Venus. Pluto is like Pluto is the id, the Freudian id, the instincts, and Venus is beauty and love and what we're attracted to, and our sense of artistic, aesthetic, creative sensibility, the romantic impulse, sensuality, is all in a conjunction with Pluto. So you see people with Venus Pluto, they tend to have they love with the depth of their soul. They have like a robust love for life, like passion towards other people or towards nature, with the world. It just increases the love. Like it's, I think, interestingly, I thought maybe we would see like some secret affairs and stuff come to light during this time period, because often Pluto is what's repressed and what's kept secret, the underworld, and Venus with love and romance, that we might see something like that. But what was interesting, right when it came into orb, the Pope actually came out and said that sins of the flesh are they're not the most egregious sin, is what he basically said. So it was kind of affirming, the life, vital needs of the romantic impulse, right? And the potential for secret affairs happening during Venus Pluto times is much more ripe. So I thought that was an interesting just anecdote that came out.
When did Venus came in? Because now we're seeing the 6th of May, so we're a little bit in the future. When
yes. Good question. So this is when it first started, November 30th. So yeah, you can see this will be the dates here, and it's also listed over here. But yeah, so right around November 28th, this is about a 5 to 6 degree orb. That's what we consider operative for personal transits. It may have been a little earlier than that, but now I'll move in weeks. So
this is very interesting. I always say like correlation. I just go and check on my calendar and say correlations of that, of what was happening there. And that particular day was an extremely interesting one for revealing things in my romantic life, actually.
That's
especially that weekend. Yeah.
Interesting, because specifically when Venus goes retrograde, it's more of a revealing or a review, looking backwards and reviewing and taking more time to readdress things is a very retrograde phenomena. So it makes a lot of sense that you had that type of an experience. And what's really kind of lovely about this, and yeah, I'm going to move in weeks now, is that this the Venus Pluto conjunction will continue on, because here at the end of January, what happens is Mars comes into conjunction with Venus, and they will, because Venus is moving slowly now and Mars is a slower planet, it will be a much longer conjunction than it would be normally. Normally it'd be like 2 weeks or so, but this is going to last for a good solid month or so, maybe a little more. So beginning in late January, the Mars-Venus conjunction, and you see Mars-Venus with just social dynamic creative actions. Like it's the yin and the yang of the romantic creative dynamic aspects of who we are. So like the assertive warrior, principle of Mars, like, taking action, is combined with Venus's aesthetic, romantic, sensual, artistic, creative dynamic. So like, it's a very erotic, dynamic, creative, playful energy. and they're, yeah, we'll just follow it here. They stay in conjunction. Let's pick up. Yeah, so this is February 6th, and then they become exact right around Valentine's Day. And this is also moving back into the conjunction with Pluto, which becomes really tight here at the end of February. Sorry, it's got a little bit of a hang up on it. And they stay together, they move into Aquarius. So that's all happening in the mid to latter parts of Capricorn. So if anyone has Capricorn placements or anything in Aries, Libra, or Cancer, would also be affected by those.
I think I will be affected from many different sides of it. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yes. And then, so that's going to be a really playful, dynamic, artistic, creative, socially engaging. Hopefully, some, we'll have more freedoms to go out and see and be with each other. But there's one complex that begins here also in the latter part of February that I'm really excited about, which is Neptune is in Pisces, which is its ruling sign. It's really at home in the sign of Pisces. But Neptune is the imagination. It's the great mother goddess. It is the archetypal realm, like, and our dreams, like everything that's transpersonal, that's transcendent. Whereas Saturn, it's the last planet you can see with the naked eye, and it was the last planet in astrology up until 1781, and it represents the ending of things and the physical world, mortality, death, structures, like I was mentioning. But Neptune is everything that transcends the physical world. It's love, it's consciousness, it's everything that's intangible. The imagination, you can't quantify it. It's not something you can mathematically study in the world and physical objects. And so it has a lot to do with our perception, the way we perceive the world, our orientation towards the divine. And Jupiter is the largest planet, and it tends to magnify whatever it's in relationship with. It tends to just support it for more robust expression. And when Jupiter and Neptune come into alignment, there tends to be an expansion of the Neptunian principle and a bit of a numinous quality, whereas like the numinous enchanted archetypal dimension, the meaningful dimension of the world that we in the mechanistic worldview have really stripped away and don't really perceive as much as we used to, it'll be more amplified beginning in February, and it becomes really strong in April, but it doesn't end until January of next year, really. Aries, it becomes exact here in April, mid-April, and then it goes into Aries and retrogrades, and this is in July, and then it comes back into Pisces, conjoining Neptune again in December here. So what's happening when that happens is we describe it as a field of influence. So right as it comes into orb in late February, the field is activated, the Jupiter-Neptune field, and that field doesn't end its activation until Jupiter comes out of the orb completely in January of next year.
Wow,
so
it's really interesting. Yeah.
So like what's happening is this whole year, starting in late February, will be colored by an amplification of Neptunian vision on some level. And this can be both more enchanting and allow us to see the archetypes more clearly, allow us to see the numinous realms, to be awe-inspired by the transcendent beauty and creativity, to recognize it, to move into imaginal relationship with it. All of that is is more ripe. And then it also can be delusional. The escapist parts, like we discussed just a little bit earlier, like the desire to escape reality and into a more enchanted reality, but a false one potentially is a potential as well. So like, I'm a little concerned about this because we already have so much delusion happening. We have 70 million people who believe in a big lie, pervade, by a psychopath. And like the potential for an amplification of more delusion is also a part of this. Like the shadow side of Jupiter Neptune is like utopic visions that aren't grounded in reality. Like too overly amplified escapist tendencies ultimately is what's happening.
Which would also kind of make sense after the almost 3 years of oppression, right? Like it would be very normal from the human psyche to try to escape. Exactly. At the same time, it's like, I think it's like, it's always, both possibilities are equally, probably they will be happening at the same amount. I kind of feel that they happen both the shadow and the light, just in different contexts,
Absolutely.
So I feel that we might see a lot of complete utopia, ungrounded utopia, meta ungrounded utopia happening. Exactly. And also at the same time, maybe a lot of new ideas are actually finally finding the support and the understanding of how they can reshape the world at the same time.
Exactly. The metaverse is a great example of the potential for escapist and more abstraction. Not that it won't have some value, I'm sure it will, but that's exactly right. And the tendency for us to the desire to want to escape from the traumatic situation is clearly going to be a desire, but the capacity to also see it authentically is very much there. Sorry for that pause. One thing that's really going to be helpful, I think, in seeing it is there's going to be a movie called Changing of the Gods released on February 22nd.
Oh, that's really interesting, because that date actually has been coming a lot for also in possible spiritual action around, like decentralized spiritual action. That's interesting. Exactly. Yeah, it is exactly that date.
Yeah, so ritual is very much a Jupiterian phenomenon, and spiritual action is the Neptunian. So yes, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, so that's part of why it's being released then. And it's also just when it became complete just recently. And it's a 10-part documentary series on Richard Tarnas's work in Cosmos and Psyche. It's specifically focused on the Uranus-Pluto alignments through history, which we've just left a Uranus-Pluto decade from 2007 through 2020. And it had this radical revolutionary impulse, like kind of like the 60s, where like the 60s had civil rights, and then the 2008 we had our first Black president, like a direct, we had women's rights, we almost had Hillary Clinton as a president, like the evolutionary, but like you can see a lot of the radical revolutionary impulses of this decade are correlated to the 60s as well. So yeah, we're really excited about the film. It's going to, it starts being released on the 22nd of February. And then I think it's going to be like one episode a day. And then it gets like re-released as a whole project, I think, on a bigger platform at some point.
Are you somehow involved?
A little bit, not a whole lot, but a little bit. Yeah, I've had other work that
would be really interesting, because we're also for another project, we're looking at creating the 12 archetypals for women. That's for women empowerment, and really actually having people matching the archetypal structures into how we create products, how we allow people to align with with matter in a different way, just really in a deeper way. And how do you actually choose the objects that are around you, not only by the design and the brand and everything, but also what effect it's going to end up having in the archetypes you want to acquire more, or that you are entering maybe in your life.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. I'd like to know.
Yeah, I will totally tell you more about it. That's been coming like lately a lot for a possible collection of warrior jewelry. Yeah.
Right. Wow, that sounds really exciting. Sounds very, very, very fitting. So yeah, I think the Jupiter-Neptune alignment has a lot of potential grace in it. And like, it's interesting, the original Avatar was released the last time Jupiter and Neptune were in a conjunction 12 years ago or something. And it has that type of an archetypal effect, like the enchanted numinous reality that's described in Avatar is similar to what we're describing here. You know, like it's a re-enchantment of the material world. Like we're beginning to see the sacred within, rather than imposing it or trying to bring it from somewhere else. Like that's the biggest insight that I've come to in all of this understanding, is that like that it's not, there's no separation. Like the archetypes are within us, and all we're really trying to do is identify them and get in touch with them, so that, you know, identify them so that we can develop a more conscientious relationship with them. Because it's like everything from the way that we feel and our anxiety is a Saturnian phenomenon. It's like whenever we have anxiety, it's a matter of getting a relationship with the archetype of Saturn. And that's something we can do. We can cultivate it consciously on all these different levels, multi-dimensional levels in which they're operating on. And so, yeah, I'm excited that we, you know, this whole year may have this enriched capacity for depth and meaning, and seeing more clearly the numinous dimension of reality. So there could be the opposite too. There could be a lot of escapism as well. But that's an exciting alignment for sure. Another thing to look at is, I mean, I mentioned it last time, but Saturn is in a square to Uranus, and that's been happening since the beginning of the pandemic, actually, but it's become a lot tighter this last year. And like the Civil War was a Saturn square Uranus period. So this, like, you know, the progressive and the conservative forces, that kind of tug of war between them, that's very much happening this entire year. And we could see more economic collapses. Like Saturn is infrastructure, like I was saying, the integrity of structures, like, so all structures, and Uranus can destabilize them. So it can be like a unexpected, sudden kind of disruption or collapse. Like you know, everything from like the Texas power grid failure last year to the building collapse in Miami, the sudden building collapse, this infrastructure collapse, to like our supply chains and stuff like that being mixed up, or even I think there's more cyber attacks now than there ever have been. Cyber, Uranus is electricity and the internet and technology, and Saturn is the problematic dimension. There's more cyber attacks than there's ever been. But just infrastructure and structures in general, and how the stability of those structures are kind of potentially up for sudden changes and stuff. Like the Great Resignation is part of it. People are quitting their jobs. Quitting is Saturn, or sudden, you know, suddenly wanting to be free and to do something new, novel, irrespective of the responsibilities potentially. So that's a big part of the tug of war kind of energy, that the tension of opposing forces and the kind of just generalized anxiety that's in the field at the time, at this time. And then it's interesting, we have a lunar eclipse the eclipses this year are in the sign of Taurus and Scorpio. And this is where Uranus is. Uranus is in the sign of Taurus, and the eclipses this year, like there's a lunar eclipse on the day of the election that we have. And it's in this really tight alignment with Saturn and Uranus. And just the fact that the eclipses themselves are on Uranus this year also speaks to exciting, novel, revelatory potentials, because Uranus is revelation and new and novel, and having the eclipses take place there, it's interesting. I have no idea like which way we're going, or or the progressive or conservative forces are have the upper hand or whatnot, but it will be a big tension. The one other thing here is Mars. It only goes retrograde every 2 years, and it's doing a retrograde motion in November. I think it starts in October, and it's square to Jupiter and Neptune. And this is kind of interesting because this is the Mars placement for the United States when the United States was born in 1776 was here. Mars was then at this degree roughly at Gemini. So we're going through a Mars return, and it's Neptune is also a part of this, and the United States Neptune is over here exactly. It's in an opposition to where it was when we were born. And that violent fantasy and the potential for imaginative, like it's definitely a ripe thing that's happening on the right in particular. There's a lot of polling saying, is it worth democracy? Should we take up violence to, those are the questions that are being asked in our society today. And having a Mars retrograde with Neptune right around the time of the election also kind of, it's an interesting dynamic. I'm not going to make predictions, but it's an interesting dynamic. So those are the big alignments. The Saturn Uranus alignment, it's really tight here, and it's tight through the end of the year. But the Jupiter Neptune, I have a lot of hope for, and just in the spring, the next few weeks, this Mars Venus conjunction with Pluto has a real ripe, creative, dynamic energy to it. So like, if you've been postponing any artistic projects or whatnot, it's a great time to take advantage of that over the next through February and March. Is really very fervent, fertile energy to work with.
Very interesting. Very interesting what's coming up, and thank you for showing that a bit. It's like, as always, like I'm extremely curious knowing how the stars will be moving, see how we will be aligning with them, like personally and collectively. It's almost like, let's see what humanity will do with all of that, like this kind of like, wow, I have no idea what will mean in reality, and I'm so interested to see what will mean in reality.
Yes, exactly. Me too. There's a lot of things that are on the precipice of change, it seems. And there's have you seen the new movie Don't Look Up?
No, not yet.
Yeah. I think it's really good. And, a lot of, I guess the critics are saying it's exaggerated, hyperbolic kind of thing. But honestly, yes, of course, there's some of that, but I think it's actually pretty reflective of the state of neurosis that we have. There's a tremendous amount of denial that's taking place throughout our society on the left and the right. We constantly keep buying Amazon stuff, and we know that it's destroying the planet, like we're kind of stuck in this materialistic worldview that we've really adopted and identified with. And the transformation ahead is a death rebirth process. The identity that's that we've cultivated that's overly identified with the material world, it has to die on a certain level, and or surrender to the cosmos itself, to the feminine, to the breath, to the chaos in it, in the magical creative sense of it, rather than our continued desire to impose our will and order onto reality, rather than finding our place within it. It's and that's the difference between an I-it and an I-thou relationship. And it might be as simple as that, and as simple as cultivating the right hemispheres, capacity for context, and and just like moving into the imaginal interpretive orientation, because it requires the imagination to work with the archetypes in a poetic way in order to discern the meaning. And we ultimately also have to do this together as a collective, because no one person sees it clearly. It has to be a group, a collective effort to see the truth, to see how the archetypes are actually manifesting.
Absolutely. And by having said that, and as we go slowly into closing, it's really interesting what you're expressing, because that's exactly what has been happening, like also in Warriors, because we started a collaboration process, and it's a very interesting process just to see the how it all plays out in a way. And it would be quite interesting to see when people drop in and drop out, and for what reasons. And I kind of feel that there is this collective game played in a micro scale that we're all playing in either our families or our constellations, our businesses, or everything. It's almost like a microcosmos of what is really happening in the bigger plane. And it would be extremely interesting at some point, maybe towards the end of the process that we have passed, maybe we can go through and see, okay, which people came in when, and when they dropped out, and for what reasons. That would be really interesting. Almost make like a different type of analysis of why things are playing out, and not just simplify just into the I don't have time, or I just don't want to be there, or I want to be there, or I feel it, or like all of that. Kind of there are bigger forces that are playing upon us many times, and it's interesting to explore that.
Yes, like nested fractals. Like there's I think it works in fractal layers
exactly
of reality. Yeah. So like there's the little small interpersonal world where those same patterns are happening, and then yes, bigger shells and with other people and the world as a whole. Exactly. And I think the archetypal complexes will reflect that
absolutely
in your natal chart, and and in your transits.
Such an interesting I don't know how to call it, journey that you took us today. Thank you so much, Chad, also for sharing the first part. This is extremely interesting, of really understanding a bit of the context of how we're moving into the processes of the death and rebirth, and also see a little bit what's coming up. And I'm really curious to see really how it's going to play out. So thank you so much for that. It would be interesting to have these explorations on a level, like really start connecting and seeing how they're playing out and how they are related in a way. Maybe that could be an option for the next one at some point.
To go into more detail, more nuance. Yeah, exactly. That's where the real rich interpretive understanding comes from.
And also I feel that like this type of archetypal work can be extremely interesting for constellations of groups, like for groups, for people, like not just one person, but seeing like a group how is working, or a team how is it working, or a collective, a small community. because I feel that we still don't have, how can I say, it still remains very personal, the level of interaction in teamwork or in community work. And when it remains only in the personal layer, I have difficulty to express that. Actually, I don't know how, like, I feel that we are seeing at the lower levels of the human possibilities, when we could see us as really as players of a bigger game.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One way I've described it is like in Plato's allegory of the cave. The idea is that we're seeing shadows on the wall that have been projected from an artificial source, and they're, the prisoners are chained to and seeing the shadows, but you can get out of that situation and see that it's not, that there's a deeper context for what's actually creating the shadows, and it gives you a deeper understanding that contextualizes the previous reality you thought was real. And it's kind of like that.
Exactly.
And there's a way in which you can, the ways in which we're relating are these surface kind of relations that aren't seeing the depth of who we are. And when you look at individual charts, it can actually help you have insight and compassion for other people, because you see where they're operating from, in a sense. Like if they're struggling with a certain complex, you can see why that's happening, in a sense, and it can help you identify with them in a compassionate way. Like
absolutely
seeing it, and then yeah, it helps, and it can actually help us stylize how we communicate with each other, because we'll understand, you can understand a little bit better how people orient towards the world, what they're oriented towards, and then how to stylize what you're saying relative to the way that they can hear it.
Absolutely. And I see that a lot, like playing also in the 4 elements that are also connected to the archetypes anyway, of how people are tapping into them, in and out of them, and relating to them, and both the fears, but also the expansions and the limitations and the way they move forward. It's really related. So by the time they start connecting to it, they can really remove this guilt and be able to tap into their power instead of the limitations, because they kind of see where it's coming from.
Exactly. Like the Truth and Reconciliation project that in South Africa, that's very much a Saturn-Pluto phenomenon. You're working with the same archetypal complexes that are responsible, for the violence and the perpetrating of violence on others. But it's the superego and the conscience Saturn that has to have the reckoning with the facts of what has been done, what has been perpetrated, and integrate that new understanding. And yeah, it's part of the same archetypal complex that you're working with, that is both perpetrator and redeemer ultimately. But it's like two sides of the same coin, but it requires that really nuanced, careful, deep approach to really tease out and get to the healing aspects of what otherwise previously would have been trauma.
Thank you so much for today. I think we can go on forever, but I think it's also time that we conclude for tonight. Super interesting. Thank you so much. And let's see when the next exploration is coming up to bring more light into the way we're seeing the world. Let's say it like that. Just a different way. Thank you, Chad.
Yes, thank you. I look forward to it. You too, likewise. Bye-bye.
I'm trying to close Zoom. It's gonna take a moment. It got overcharged also. There we go.